Good morning and welcome to the first of our autumn webinar series focusing on the NEC4 suite of contracts. This series of 3 webinars will start with today's introduction, looking at the background, principles, structure, changes from NEC3 and some of the common issues of NEC4 contracts. The following 2 webinars will focus on the administration of NEC4 contracts and the assessment of compensation events under NEC4. Please use the link on screen to sign up for these upcoming webinars if you have not already done so. Also, all of our webinars are recorded and available on our YouTube channel so that you can listen again or share with a colleague. Now, before we begin properly, there are just a few housekeeping matters. To minimize background noise, I have placed you all on mute. If you would like to ask questions, please do so using the webinar chat function, the question function. In order to keep within 30 minutes, we will be answering as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation, rather than as we go along. I am Nathaniel Buckingham, a partner in the commercial disputes team at Shepherd and Wedderburn, specialising in construction and engineering disputes. Before I became a lawyer, I was a chartered civil engineer working for an international consultancy and designing the engineering aspects of a variety of industrial, hospital, school, and commercial buildings. This brings an important practical experience to my approach as a lawyer. I am joined today by Hayley Russell, a solicitor in my team, who also specialises in resolving construction disputes. We regularly advise clients on a whole range of projects and claims, which often require strategic and commercial thinking. As construction dispute specialists, we have an up-to-date understanding of the legislative, court, and industrial context of disputes, but also have a strong commercial focus. We advise clients on the various standard form construction contracts on a regular basis, including the NEC contracts, JCT, and FIDIC. And our clients include local authorities and universities, employers, developers, building contractors, and facilities managers. That variety of practices and clients means that we have usually seen disputes from a variety of different angles before, and that experience forms the basis of the advice that we can give to clients and the information that we will be sharing with you today. Please do feel free to contact either of us using the contact details on screen to discuss this webinar topic or any other construction issue, question, or dispute that you may have. I'm now going to pass over to Hayley, who will run through the agenda for today's webinar.
Thank you, Nathaniel. As Nathaniel mentioned, today we are providing an introduction to the NEC4 contracts and principles. We will start by providing a brief background to NEC contracts, particularly considering the philosophy behind the standard form contracts. We will then consider the structure of NEC4 contracts before considering some of the key changes that have been made in NEC4 from NEC3. Finally, we will identify some of the typical standard form gaps and pitfalls to be aware of when using NEC4 contracts. No doubt many of you may be familiar with the NEC form of contracts. We still regularly act in relation to NEC3 contracts, although the take-up of NEC4 is growing steadily, particularly in the public sector. Hopefully, today will be a useful reminder of the general principles and approach of NEC contracts, whilst focusing on NEC4 particularly, and the changes since NEC3, which we can then expand on over the next 2 webinars. So let's begin with some background and history of NEC contracts. Historically, the construction industry in the UK was very adversarial, with lots of disputes, often delaying projects, but with no mechanism. The UK government commissioned several reports that aim to establish the key industry problems and how the construction industry's performance could be improved. As well as NEC contracts, that led to the introduction of statutory adjudication and construction-specific payment provisions. For disputes, the report started a shift in attitude within the construction industry towards less adversarial and more collaborative working models. In 1993, the NEC contracts were introduced, and they have gradually been adopted on large-scale construction projects, including international projects, with significant backing from the public sector. So, what are the objectives and the philosophy of NEC contracts? It may be unusual to discuss the philosophy of a legal document or contract, but it is helpful with NEC contracts to consider their underlying philosophy, as it does underpin the objectives and the drafting of those contracts, and therefore their use and their interpretation. And as those of you who use NEC contracts will know, it is quite different to traditional contracts. As we've already mentioned, NEC contracts promote best practice and collaborative working, which is encapsulated in the overarching requirement to act in the spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. This mirrors the first key principle that was identified in one of the early reports by Michael Latham and is specifically referred to in the contract as an obligation. Whilst this can sometimes be criticised as a statement of aspiration only, it does signal a contrast to the traditional adversarial approach to contracting in the UK. NEC is intended to be a contract which helps you actually manage the project, and not a contract that is simply signed and left in a drawer only to be looked at in the event of a dispute, a problem, or a claim.
Alternative standard forms of contracts, such as JCT or FIDIC, still largely reflect a traditional adversarial approach. And these standard forms, that's JCT or FIDIC, would be quite difficult to amend to substantially shift that focus. Even those with partnering options are really unable to match the collaborative and management approach of the NEC contracts. Our experience is that when the contract is operated properly, many of these collaborative aims are fulfilled, and disputes and issues can be resolved contemporaneously. However, NEC contracts do still come with their own pitfalls, which we will discuss in the later half of this webinar. NEC4 was introduced to reflect feedback from users during the 12 years since NEC3 was introduced. NEC describes the introduction of NEC4 as an evolution, not revolution. NEC4 has been designed to capture industry developments and user best practice by improving contract administration, reducing administration cost, and increasing flexibility. NEC4 also includes improved risk opportunity and management.
We will now take a look at the forms, structure, and layout of NEC4 contracts. Firstly, as a reminder, NEC contracts are a suite of contracts which cover professional services appointments, frameworks, engineering contractor contracts and subcontracts, and term service contracts. NEC4 has introduced 5 further forms of contract. Firstly, the design, build and operate contract, which could be used for some, for example, renewable energy contracts, where the contractor may also be appointed to operate and maintain. Secondly, the alliance contract. This is a multi-party contract for use where the client wants to fully integrate the design and construction team and is likely only going to be used for major complex contracts. Thirdly, the facilities management contract, which is specifically for the operation and management of a facility after construction. Then fourthly, we also have the professional services subcontract. This is used for sub-consultancy appointments, which may be useful where there is a lead designer who may be responsible for all disciplines and sub-consults to others. For example, an architect who sub-consults the engineering elements. Finally, the 5th contract NEC4 has introduced is the term services subcontract. This contract allows the contractor under a term contract to subcontract using a similar form. It should also be noted that the guidance for NEC contracts has also been updated for NEC4.
Focusing on the main engineering and construction contracts, the structure of NEC4 contracts follows the same format as NEC3. So those of you who are familiar with NEC3 should feel at home with NEC4 in terms of the structure and layout. The contract is made up of core clauses common to all contracts, and then main, secondary, and additional option clauses with the cost components and contract data at the end. The core clauses cover the main terms and conditions and are the same across all of the contracts, regardless of the main and secondary options selected. The core clauses set out the main responsibilities of the contractor, time elements such as programme and completion, testing and defects, payment, compensation events, which are the events which would entitle the contractor to more time or more money or both, risks and insurance, and termination. Then you choose a main option clause, and these main option clauses relate to pricing and provide options A to F depending on whether the pricing approach is fixed, target, or cost reimbursable, and whether pricing is based on an activity schedule where the contractor is paid for completed activities, or a more traditional bill of quantities approach. Next, the W option clauses are selected, and these relate to dispute resolution. And there are different W option clauses depending on whether or not the project falls under the Construction Act 1996 in the UK in terms of the statutory adjudication provisions. NEC4 has also introduced a third option, dispute resolution option, for projects not covered by the 1996 Act, where the dispute can be referred to a dispute avoidance board. And in all cases, the disputes can be referred onwards to a tribunal, being either arbitration or court. The secondary option clauses are known as X clauses, and parties are free to decide which of these clauses to select and apply in their circumstances. The X clauses cover things such as inflation, change in law, parent company guarantees, performance bonds, and retention. Then there are also a number of UK-specific secondary option clauses known as Y clauses, covering the payment mechanisms for contracts covered by the UK Construction Act 1996. So the contract is formed by picking parts of the standard form drafting that are required for your project, with this selection being clearly recorded in the contract data section. This approach is intended to provide for a shorter, more flexible standard form contract, which can be applied to different contracts without substantial amendment. Then additional clauses are known as Z clauses and are usually used to amend a contract where desired, for example, with respect to design responsibility or additional compensation events or treatments. There are no standard form drafted Z clauses, but developers and contractors, and particularly their lawyers, who regularly use NEC contracts, will no doubt have a bank of standard Z clauses that can be proposed and deployed as appropriate. Now, we see these Z clauses ranging from reasonable required amendments to reflect specific circumstances of a project to wholesale amendments that really cut through and change the philosophy of the underlying NEC4 contract. So the Z clauses give full flexibility to essentially do what you like with the NEC contracts. And finally, in terms of structure, the contract concludes with the schedule of cost components, which is used for pricing, and the contract data itself, which is the project-specific data, such as the parties, the works description, and the specifics of the main, secondary, and additional clauses selected. This contract data section is the main section, which is completed, filled in and completed.
We will now take a look at some of the key changes that have been made to the NEC4 form of contract, so that those who are already familiar with NEC3 can appreciate the differences in NEC4. We will not have sufficient time to look at all of the changes, but we will highlight some of the important ones. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we have 2 further webinars So we will not be discussing any of the changes relating to either the administration of the contract or compensation events, as those changes will be discussed in our upcoming webinars. Now, the most obvious change to NEC4 contracts are the changes to terminology. All of the NEC4 contracts have been firstly redrafted to be gender neutral, so there are no more references in this contract to him or his. Another change that has been introduced is that the references to the employer has been replaced by client, which historically was a more familiar term. The document that sets out works information has changed to become known as the scope. Now, this is for the consistency throughout the contracts, rather than, for example, works information, service information, or goods information. Employer risks have also been renamed. Now, these have been renamed to client liabilities, and to be honest, that better describes what they are and what they always have been. Finally, I'll draw attention to the fact that the risk register is now an early warning register. And again, we consider this to be a welcome change, as it previously caused some confusion for parties, believing that the risk register allocated risks as between the parties, rather than being the project management tool for managing risks and issues, which it was intended to be. The early warning register remains just the agenda for the next early warning meeting.
The NEC4 contract introduces some changes to existing NEC3 clauses. Some of the key changes include, firstly, in clause 22, the right for the client to use the contractor's design has been expanded slightly by referring to other purposes as stated in the contract, rather than just being as stated in the works information. Now, it's worth noting that NEC4 is still fairly light in dealing with copyright and intellectual property issues. This is increasingly an area of concern and focus for our clients in the industry, who will often require an ability to grant sub-licenses for the use of design or drawings produced, even just, for example, for marketing or other uses. And this area is likely to continue to be the subject of Amendment Z clauses. In clause 26.2, the requirement for the contractor to submit the subcontract conditions of contract to the PM for approval has now been expanded to include all subcontract documents, except pricing information, unless it's a target price option. I think the principle here is to expand transparency and openness beyond subcontract terms to include all subcontract documents. However, this could be a very onerous process, but subject to a couple of exceptions, needs to be completed prior to the appointment of any subcontractor. In clause 36, the ability to propose acceleration is now available to both the contractor as well as the project manager, and the process leads to quotations and agreement to accelerate if acceptable. Then in clause 44.3, the defect certificate is now to be issued at the defect's date if all notified defects have been made good, or otherwise it's at the earliest of the last defect correction period, or once all defects have been made good. Whereas under NEC3, the defect certificate was issued on the later of the defect's date and the end of the last defects correction period. Now, this better reflects when the defect certificate really should be issued. It's either at the defect date, if everything's good, or otherwise, as soon as all defects have been corrected.
Yes. Another change is that Section 8 of NEC4 has been substantially rewritten. As we mentioned earlier, the list of employers' risks are now client liabilities. The provisions are similar, but they are not the same. One of the key changes to that section is that previously the contractor carried all of the risks that the employer did not hold. That provision has now been removed because it was far too wide and uncertain, and it has been replaced with contractors' liabilities, which can be reviewed against the agreed risk profile and insurance arrangements. A further key change in this section is that the two-way general indemnity in NEC3 has been removed and replaced with a more tailored statement of each party's particular liabilities. While this is an improvement from NEC3, We still don't think NEC4 addresses the insurance industry's concerns about risk liabilities and insurance provisions within NEC. For major insurance projects, we still feel that it is critical that specialist insurance advice is taken and if appropriate, that Z clauses are added to the contract. Another welcome change is the deletion of clause 82.1. This clause required the contractor to replace any loss of and repair any damage to the works, plant and materials until the defects was issued, unless otherwise instructed by the project manager. Whilst the contractor would have been entitled to a compensation event if the damage was not their fault, it was still a very onerous clause and could cause issues, for example, if the contractor and employer were in dispute as to whether the damage was the contractor's fault. As we mentioned, a new clause W3 has also introduced a dispute avoidance board, following in the footsteps of the likes of FIDIC, and likely with an eye to the international users. The dispute avoidance board is nominated at the start of the project and becomes familiar with the project as it progresses, making regular visits to the site. Disputes that arise are then referred to the dispute avoidance board, who will discuss the issues with parties and try to find a solution. If it is not resolved, they will propose a recommendation. It is likely that dispute avoidance boards are a luxury that would only be used on projects of certain scale and value. Please note that there are some critical changes introduced by NEC4 that relate to the programme and to compensation events, which we will discuss in our further webinars.
The NEC contracts, like most standard form contracts, were not really designed to be amended, and the drafters would really prefer for them to be used unamended. And the changes to NEC4 from NEC3 were intended to bridge the gap with some of the pitfalls identified and some of the standard amendments commonly used by users in NEC3. However, unfortunately, we don't think it does bridge all those gaps, and the practice remains for Z clauses to be used to introduce amendments. These amendments usually seek to alter the balance of risk under the standard form, but also sometimes they are used to bring clarity where the standard form still hasn't achieved this, even with the updates to NEC4. So we will now have a look at some of the common gaps and pitfalls of the NEC4 standard form contract. These are really some of the areas that we advise clients to consider and where we usually see proposals for amendments as the contracts are negotiated. Now, the first gap in is in the definitions within NEC contracts generally, and this is the same in NEC4 as it was in NEC3. These contracts the NEC contracts have two types of defined terms: those that are defined in the contract data section, usually written in italics, and those that are defined within the core clauses section, usually written with initial capital letters. NEC contracts do not have an exhaustive list of definitions, which sets it apart from other standard form contracts. What that means is that many usual and obvious definitions are missing, and it is usual to add these. And an example would be the definition of applicable law. Whilst NEC3 does note varying obligations on the parties with regards to applicable laws, it does not define what this is, and therefore the extent of the obligations linked to applicable law are uncertain. NEC4 has not introduced any changes to this approach, so adding a definition simply fills this gap and eliminates a needless uncertainty for all parties. Another pitfall to be aware of is the importance of completing the contract data, as this information often doubles as a definition referred to in the conditions. So, for example, all references to the works leads back to the box in the contract data, and therefore any failure to complete that with an adequate definition, or worse, leaving it empty, would result in a gaping hole across the contract. So the importance of both parties completing their sections of the contract data accurately and in full cannot be stressed enough. Also, because the contract structure provides for all descriptions of the scope and specification of the works to be contained in external technical documents, it is really important that these are listed fully in the contract data and that they are accurate. This applies equally to contractors' design documents. Another common problem with NEC contracts is generally the language used is in the present tense and legal jargon is avoided. Now that might seem like a positive thing, but it means that terms that we are all probably familiar with, such as force majeure or latent defects, are avoided. And in NEC4, wherever possible, identical phrases are used and repeated. Now, the downside to this approach really is that some of those standard terms, which the drafters have avoided because they're too legalistic, actually have quite a history of case law behind them to provide certainty as to their meaning. The simple language used in the present tense in NEC4 can therefore actually create uncertainty when trying to apply it to real situations and against previous case law. And so, again, we typically see amendments to bring in these standard terms and definitions for clarity.
Another gap in the NEC contract is that it doesn't provide, in NEC3, sorry, it doesn't provide for what is to happen when the project manager rejects a contractor's programme or if the project manager does not respond. And in practice, this meant that projects often proceeded with no accepted programmes. In NEC4, one of the changes included to provide for a treated acceptance of the contractor's programme by the project manager if the project manager does not respond to a programme issued by the contractor for acceptance. However, NEC4 still does not cover what happens if the programme is rejected. Often then, there can be an impasse where the programme is by the project manager. A contract amendment, in our opinion, would be desirable here to provide more certainty for parties. The termination provisions also need to be carefully considered and amended when necessary. The arrangement and presentation of the termination provisions in NEC contracts is helpful with a defined list of termination reasons with a procedure to follow and an amount due for each termination reason, depending on whether it is the employer or the contractor terminating. Although there are 21 reasons for termination, the reasons are fewer in scope than most practitioners would be used to or would expect. For example, the NEC4 contract has moved the termination at will provision, where an employer can terminate for any reason, from the core clauses to being a secondary option. This is probably because users have previously questioned whether a termination at will clause would be compatible with the mutual trust and cooperation clause, but this needs to be considered, particularly as an employer. There is also not a provision for termination should the contractor fail to proceed regularly and diligently with the works. Parties should be encouraged to consider this when the contract may end, and if not covered in the standard drafting, document this accordingly. In NEC3, there are no provisions for collateral warranties, nor are there any readily available drafted secondary option clauses to easily add to this requirement. So, under the NEC3 contract, if the employer requires collateral warranties for a funder or tenant, then an additional Z clause needs to be drafted to include this provision and a suitable form. NEC4 has introduced secondary option clauses which provide for collateral warranties to be secured. However, they feature under the more international term of undertakings. Collateral warranties have been a feature of the UK market for many years now, providing contractual undertakings from contractors to others with an interest in the project, such as funders, purchasers, and tenants. Whilst academics and some other parts of the industry would like to see a greater reliance on third-party right laws rather than collateral warranties, in reality, collateral warranties are likely to remain a feature of the construction contracts for a long time to come, so it is good that NEC4 has recognised them. Building information modelling often goes hand in hand with collaborative projects, yet building information modelling is not directly referred to or incorporated into NEC3. NEC guidance suggests that this is done by way of including a building information modelling protocol, such as the CIC protocol, either just by incorporating it into the works information, scope, or by using a Z clause. NEC4 has attempted to remedy this by including a new secondary option specifically to support the use of building information modelling. This new NEC4 clause requires the contractor to provide an information execution plan, which deals with issues such as the information model, information ownership, and the liability of parties. We will discuss this in more detail in the next webinar. None of the amendments that we have discussed offend against the spirit or objectives of the NEC contracts, and they are intended to bring clarity where it has been lacking. Obviously, each project will have its own peculiarities, and consideration needs to be given at the outset as to what amendments will be required. To end on a positive note, while the NEC4 contract and other NEC contracts generally have their detractors, our experience is that when both parties willingly commit to the additional project management resources necessary to operate the contract fully, there are significant benefits for managing and mitigating risks and in resolving claims as they arise in a more collaborative fashion. While some of the changes introduced by NEC4 address some of the common pitfalls of the other NEC contracts, in our opinion, they do not necessarily deal with matters in the way practitioners will prefer, and project specifics will still require additional clauses. The flexibility of NEC in its use of Z clauses is one of the advantages of the contract.
Thank you, Hayley. We've now come to the end of the presentation, which we hope has been useful and interesting. Apologies again for the slight interruption and delay at the start. We're slightly over time, but we're quite happy to answer a couple of questions in a bit of time that we have available. So if you've not already done so, please type your questions in the chat box now. And while you're doing that, just again, a reminder of the details of the next two webinars in this series, which follow on from this one and tackle NEC4 contracts in a bit more detail. So on Tuesday, the 28th of November, we will be considering the administration of NEC4 contracts. And on Tuesday, the 12th of December, we'll be considering how the NEC4 contract deals with compensation events, one of the hottest topics that you can cover in NEC4. So if you haven't already signed up, please do so by visiting the news and events section of the website. And finally, as I mentioned at the beginning, this webinar has been recorded. So if you'd like to listen to it again, or if you want to share it with a colleague, please do so. And again, the details of that are on the screen, and we'll circulate details to you after the webinar. Now, and just have a look here. We've got a question. So the first question I'll answer is, question is whether dispute resolution boards can be used in the UK. Now, we said W3 is the option that introduces dispute resolution boards, and that is for use when it's a non-UK project. So strictly speaking, if you just pick option W3, it doesn't really work in the UK. That doesn't mean you can't do it in the UK. I think the reason for that is, obviously, in the UK, you always have the statutory right for adjudication. So you would need to introduce dispute resolution boards through a Z clause that kind of captured how those two things would interact. In other words, you may have a dispute resolution board that can operate, but that would not be, you would also have to allow adjudication at any time. So the question is whether it would be helpful to have those two things running in parallel, which I think is the reason why it's not drafted for UK use at the moment. We do see dispute resolution boards cropping up more regularly in contracts, actually. So I think particularly on large projects and even under NEC4, we will see that as a feature that grows in time. One other question I'll answer is just that question is how often we see NEC3 or 4 used in place of JCT, and whether we're seeing an adoption of NEC4. I mean, JCT is still used quite often, particularly by for traditional contracts by developers, heavy engineering and engineering projects with clients who know and feel familiar with the JCT suites. We definitely see quite a good introduction of NEC contracts by the public sector because it's mandated often for big public sector bodies to use NEC. And where it is public sector, they are tending to now pick up the NEC4 contracts and perhaps having to in many cases. So I think we are definitely, over the last decade, it's really become quite a prevalent used contract. And most people who are familiar with NEC3 are moving to NEC4 because they see the developments as being quite positive. So yes, is the answer to that question. We do see it used a lot. Okay, that's probably all the time that we have. If we've not answered your question, and I can see a couple more, we can come back to you after this webinar with a specific answer, but thank you for asking them. Just before we go, there is a short QR code on this slide, which you can scan using your phone to answer a short survey on today's webinar. This survey covers the format, content, timings of our webinar, and asks if there are particular topics that you'd like us to cover in future. We would really appreciate you completing this survey because it helps us to deliver webinars in a way that you find most useful, covering topics that suit. So yes, we'd very much appreciate if you could take the time to fill out this short survey. All that remains then to say is thanks again for joining. We look forward to welcoming you at our next webinar in a couple of weeks' time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.